Hello and welcome to this webinar on Where Did Equity Improve? The topic is covered in the most recent issue of PISA in Focus, which you can find on our website www.oecd.org/PISA. Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, will present some of the key findings related to this issue that emerged from the PISA 2015 report. He will also be available to answer your questions after his presentation. Please feel free to send your questions to Eric Magnuson using the chat function at any time during the presentation. Andreas?
Yes, thanks so much for your interest. I'm delighted to share some of the findings and also going in greater depth in our analysis concerning equity. I want to just start with a brief reminder on what PISA 2015 was. It was our last assessment in the context of the PISA series that regularly assessed 15-year-olds in over 70 countries for their skills. They basically take a test. In this case, a test focused on science, but it also included assessments of math, reading, and problem-solving skills, and also social problem-solving skills. And then we collect a lot of contextual data on the background of students, their schools, and the motivation, and that gives us the angle to actually study equity-related issues. Now, in addition to that, we collect also data from parents, school principals, teachers, and system leaders on school policies, on school practices, on resources, and other institutional factors, and that can help us explain why there are inequalities in opportunities and also inequalities in outcomes. This is just a map of the countries that took part in the 2015 assessment. In gray, you find the OECD countries, and in blue, partner countries that also joined this last assessment. So let me start with just portraying the main results from the assessment. On the vertical axis, you see countries ordered by their performance on the test. Now, the higher they are, the better students on average performed in science. And on the horizontal axis, you find our main measure of equity. Basically, this is measuring the impact of social background on learning outcomes, the strength of the relationship between the socio-economic background of students and their families and the learning outcomes at school. Nobody likes to be in the red quadrant, in the left lower corner, where performance is poor and outcomes are quite inequitably distributed, only students from wealthy backgrounds do reasonable. The next quadrant is also not so great. Here learning outcomes are more equitably distributed. Social background doesn't make much of a difference, but overall levels of qualities are still quite low. Then you can argue, is it sufficient to do well on average, but also to see large social inequalities in outcomes? Singapore, the 4 provinces in China, Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Guangdong that we had are examples of that. And then, of course, everybody wants to be in the green quadrant, where learning outcomes on average are very strong and where outcomes are equitably distributed. And I'm just hearing something wrong with my sound. Can you hear me?
I believe we can hear you, yes.
Okay, good. Then let me just talk about changes in this. The purpose of today's webinar was to discuss some of the changes that we have seen in the social inequalities of learning outcomes and the drivers associated with this. And actually, if poverty would be destiny and there's nothing public policy can do about this, you'd see that picture coming out basically year after year and decade after decade in the same way. But in fact, when you look at this is where the United States was, and this is where the United States is today. You could see basically how that yellow dot moved from the left side of the chart to the center of it, showing that in the United States, overall, learning outcomes did not improve. But among the most disadvantaged students, there actually have been some significant changes. And the United States has seen the largest improvement in equity, but other countries have seen changes as well. You can see, for example, here how Bulgaria, moved slightly upwards, but a lot to the right side. You can see how Mexico has also been able to reduce the achievement gap. or Slovenia, and also Brazil. Very impressive kind of gains in terms of reducing the achievement gap, or Chile, or Montenegro, or Thailand. Unfortunately, we don't have many more examples. I mean, these were essentially the countries with big improvements in terms of closing the achievement gap. But they are sufficient to tell us actually that this is something the public policy can somehow deal with. And I want to highlight, because the United States was the country with the largest reduction in inequalities, show you that in a little bit more detail. Here you can see actually this plot of the schools that took part in the PISA test by their performance and by their social background. No? Performance is on the vertical axis and social background is on the horizontal axis. And this was the picture in 2006. So you can see as students become wealthier, you move more to the right side of the chart, performance of schools tends to be better. No? So that is the relationship between social background and performance. Now, when we did the assessment in 2015, you could see it was slightly different. And the amazing things that you can really see is how schools in disadvantage on the left side of the chart really now tend to have better performance. When you draw up this line, the regression line, it looks like this. If you look at the top end of the scale, now there's no difference. Now, wealthy schools do as well or bad as they have done in 2006. But among disadvantaged schools, you can really see how there has been achieved a significant difference. And over time, if that continues, that trend overall will also contribute to raising overall performance in the United States. But we are not yet there. There yet. No? And you can see similar patterns in other countries as well. Now, just to illustrate how much the impact of social background can differ across countries, and that's also an important perspective. When you look, for example, to the Dominican Republic, the red square shows you the performance of the 10% of the most disadvantaged students in the Dominican Republic, and the green triangle here, the performance of the 10% wealthiest students. And you can see we're talking about a quite sizable achievement gap. Coming from a very poor family puts you at a significant disadvantage in terms of PISA learning outcomes. But the interesting thing is that this achievement gap looks very different across countries. Students marked by the red square have the same background across all countries. And you can see their overall performance is actually very significant depending on where they go to school, the country. You can see, for example, the 10% of the most disadvantaged students in Vietnam or Estonia or Hong Kong or Macau, those 10% really disadvantaged students do better than the average student in the OECD area, and they do actually better than the 10% wealthiest students in many other countries. Again, it's another illustration that poverty isn't destiny, that it's really worth studying the kind of policies and practices that may in effect affect inequalities in greater detail. So that's what this presentation really is about. We're going to look at the kind of factors relative to the impact on learning outcomes and equity, and take into account the social and economic costs. Everybody wants to do things that are easy to do and very important, that's obvious. Nobody wants to spend money on things that are maybe not so important and actually turn out to be quite expensive. But, we shouldn't ignore that. There are things that are really difficult to do, but very important. And you can always pick up some low-hanging fruits, things that are maybe not that important, but that are not so costly in terms of reform. So basically, we found the main drivers in that as follows. The first is to do with making sure that there is no tolerance for failure in the system, that there's a commitment to universal achievement, that there's very little tracking, stratification in the education systems, that expectations for all students are high, and that all students achieve the report that they really need. And I put that highest because it's actually one of the strongest predictors on outcomes, but I also put it more to the left because it's actually really quite difficult to achieve. Investing resources where they make most of a difference, I put this to the right because that's what public policy can sort of do easiest, allocating money, allocating staff to where they can actually achieve most. I put that also quite high. Capacity at the point of delivery. Now, this is the agenda around teachers, about school leaders. That's really very, very hard to do. And also, it's a long-term agenda. If you build today's best teacher training institution, it's going to affect, what happens in school over many years, because those teachers will only gradually be replaced. Incentive structures and accountability. I have some interesting findings about this. Coherence in policies and practice. We're going to talk about the importance of early childhood education and care in leveling the playing field for children from all social backgrounds. But this will only make a difference if it's connected to what happens later in the lives of students. And then finally, gateways and instructional systems, examination systems, curricula. Those are the kind of easy wins, but also quite important. So I'm going to show you some of those factors. And I start with the ones that are most easiest to manage by public policy, and that's to do with resources. The first thing that you can see is actually that spending per student between the age of 6 to 15 is actually only related to learning outcomes at the low end of spending. Where countries spend, roughly up to $50,000 for each student between the age of 6 and 15, there you can really see that more spending is quite predictive for better outcomes, and in fact also for more equitable outcomes. But once you get beyond that point, spending levels are no longer a good predictor for the quality or even equity in learning outcomes. That's an important lesson. Just investing more in education will not necessarily be transformative in raising learning outcomes and achieving a more equitable distribution of learning outcomes. What may matter more has to do with how we attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms and to get the best resources to students who need them most. If you're in the green area, it means that disadvantaged schools have more resources than advantaged schools. Now, this is basically prioritizing investment in disadvantage. If you're in the red area, it means that students from disadvantaged backgrounds also get the less qualified teachers, have greater teacher shortage, have greater shortage in other types of material resources and so on. And you can see actually most countries are in that red part. In most countries, actually, resources are still invested regressively, in the sense that where students need them most, they have least access to either better material or even more to more qualified staff. So that's obviously a challenge for education systems, for most education systems, to become better in aligning resources with the needs of students. When you see the symbols in light, it means that we can't find a statistically significant difference, whereas the symbols in dark, the blue dots for material resources and the red diamond for staff, that's where the difference really is clearly visible in our comparative data. So, more money alone, not a guarantee for better or more equitable outcomes, but actually aligning resources better with needs is one of the things that are actually quite important. Here you can also see that there are quite important differences in the requirements to attend regular science lessons, depending on the social background. For example, where students are in socio-economically advantaged schools, they tend to be more likely to be required at least one science course per week than in socially disadvantaged schools. Some exceptions to this, Portugal, Iceland, Indonesia, and Macau, but apart from that, it's quite a clear pattern that in most countries, actually, if you're in a privileged school, you're going to get more hours of science learning, and that obviously is one of the predictors for better learning outcomes. So there are, again, inequalities built into the resource allocation across education systems. Here the picture gets more granular and more refined, and actually this is one of the most interesting findings here. You can actually see also, for example, when you look at outcomes, where schools have, say that the material for hands-on activities in science is in good shape, science outcomes tend to be better, almost by 10 points. But actually, this is after accounting for social background. But if you see actually the black diamond is actually much greater, it's over 20 points. And this tells us that actually social background is a big moderator of this kinds of relationship. Again, students from disadvantaged backgrounds are likely to be penalized a lot more for the quality of the material for hands-on activities, and that has an impact on their performance. The same when schools were asked, compared to other departments, our school science department is well equipped. Again, it matters, and it matters even more when you basically do not factor out the students and school socioeconomic profile. Same for, compared to similar schools, we have a well-equipped laboratory. All of those factors that you can see on the screen here really are predictive in terms of science learning, and particularly so when you actually also consider the socioeconomic profile of schools. So you could see here also, this is another way how inequalities in learning outcomes actually are built into the way in which schools are equipped, at least according to what schools themselves say in this questionnaire. Here you can see also science competitions. It's another way how schools can make science more interesting, more relevant, more engaging for students. You can see the prevalence of competitions, of such science competitions in most countries is much greater for privileged schools than for disadvantaged schools. Now the yellow dots show you how often those science competitions are offered in advantaged schools, and they are usually quite high, up to 100%, and then you can see often for disadvantaged schools the prevalence is just half of it. It's another illustration, how resource allocations build in inequalities, because once again, I'm not showing you this on the chart, but also this is a variable that is actually predictive in terms of science learning outcomes at school. Pre-primary schooling, another way we can spend resources, making sure that the smallest children, have a chance to sort of get prepared for school entry. And there you can also see, when you look at the number of years in pre-primary education among students attending school by social background, first of all, you can see it varies hugely across countries, but also it varies typically within countries between advantaged schools and disadvantaged schools. You go to a privileged school, typically students had participated for longer in pre-primary education than when you go to a disadvantaged school, in most countries at least. And that, again, is an illustration of how, inequalities are built into those kinds of science learning opportunities. Let's look at behavior. So far, we just talked about things, that you can change with resource allocations. But in terms of behavior, we also see that students skipping a whole day of school is quite importantly related to the school's socioeconomic profile. Once again, we also see that the incidence and intensity varies hugely across countries. In Japan and Korea, skipping school virtually never happens, neither in China or Chinese Taipei or Hong Kong or Iceland, Netherlands. But when you go to the other end of the spectrum, in Montenegro, in Italy, in Uruguay, the Dominican Republic, it is actually, 50 to 60% of students may say that they have skipped a day in the 2 weeks prior to the PISA test. So incidence and intensity of skipping varies hugely across countries. But what is quite consistent across countries, and that's the diamond, that students in disadvantaged schools skip a whole school day a lot more often than students in advantaged schools. The diamonds tend to be all on the lower side, not in the upper side, showing you that actually, again, disadvantage seems to be a context in which skipping school tends to be more prevalent. And again, if students miss a school day, they'll have less science opportunity, so they're going to be less prepared for science outcomes. Student and teacher behavior hindering learning and science performance. Now we can see, for example, that students lack respect for teachers according to principals. Their learning outcomes tend to be worse by about 10 points on the PISA scale, and that's after accounting for social background. When you actually look at the results as they stand, you can see the result is over 30 points, and that's basically a school year. So you can see actually again how social background actually is a variable that moderates that relationships in very significant. Same for student truancy. We talked about this already. Students skipping classes, students intimidating or bullying other students. Again, where that happens, outcomes tend to be worse. And again, social background is a big explanatory variable here. Students' use of alcohol or illegal drugs, teachers not being well prepared for classes, and teacher absenteeism. All of those are things that actually are not distributed at random, but that seem to be actually also interacting with the social background of students and therefore shaping inequalities in learning opportunities. So I mentioned so far, I've referred so far to learning outcomes. Students' expectations of a career in science is another outcome that we studied in quite detail. And here you can see basically where compared to other departments, the school science department is well equipped. Where that is the case, actually, students were more confident in a scientific career. And when you look at this, actually, also here, social background was an important predictor. Science teachers are among the best educated staff members of my school. Where that's the case, you can see better outcomes. Schools offer a science club. Now, you can see it's a predictor. Schools offer science competitions, learning time in regular classroom science hours, and time per week studying science after school in hours. Very, very important predictors for better learning outcomes. So you can see again how opportunity shapes outcomes, not just in terms of student performance on the test, but also in terms of these students expecting a career. And then, also teacher strategies in science lessons, teacher-directed instruction, positively related, the perceived feedback, adaptive instruction, inquiry-based instruction, and teacher support. All of those were predictors for students expecting to move on in their careers towards something related to science. But what's interesting is that the figures after and before accounting for social background and actually science performance are somewhat different, telling us that these things actually also interact with the social background of students and schools. Policy and practice. This is not about money. This is more related to, what we do in education. Let's have a look at some of the factors here. We can see that the first age of selection is very strongly related to equity in the distribution of learning opportunities, and also in terms of the impact of social background on learning outcomes. The earlier education systems divide students into different tracks or streams, the greater the impact of social background on learning outcomes. Recommendations of feeder schools, as you would expect, impact on equity and opportunity. At the other end of the scale, grade repetition. The more prevalent grade repetition is in an education system, the greater the impact of social background on learning outcomes. This is a summary. Let's look at some of the factors in a little bit more detail. Here you can actually see the first age at selection in the education system on the horizontal axis. You can see, for example, here countries like Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Norway, Denmark, Spain, Sweden, they tend to select students very late. Students more or less follow a common curriculum up to the age of 16, and then they get divided, at least in terms of formal tracking. If you go to the left end, you look to the Germany and Austria, students are selected at age 10. You look to the Hungary, the Slovak Republic, Czech Republic, Turkey, at age 11, students are being tracked. So this varies hugely across countries, but interestingly, you can also see that it's related not only to the impact of social background on learning outcomes, I mentioned already, but also to something like teacher support. We found that really interesting, that in countries where students are selected early on in their career, teacher support tends to be lower than in countries where students attend more comprehensive education systems. I can only speculate what the causal nature of that relationship might be, but it could be that where it's easy for teachers to put students in different tracks in schools, it's easier for them to sort of assign responsibility for this to others, as opposed to, investing themselves and helping struggling students to catch up. Maybe that's an explanation, but the relationship seems to be quite clear on that pattern. Now, in many countries, or an increasing number of countries, parents get more choice of where they enroll their children. And what you can see actually when we survey parents, that actually low expenses are more important for parents whose children attend disadvantaged schools. It's not surprising, you know, when parents are disadvantaged socioeconomically, they'll probably have less money and therefore low expenses are more important for them. No? But you can see that the yellow diamond tends to be really on the lower side of the chart. And you can also see that actually there is a difference between advantaged and disadvantaged schools on that kind of pattern. Now, why do I tell you this? And you see that on the next slide. Basically, schools' low expenses actually are a negative predictor of schooling performance. Think about this. So parents who have less money, for them, it's more important to select a school with low expenses. But if they do, actually, you can see, even after accounting for social background, even after you take that context into account, school performance tends to be lower. Conversely, when you look at school reputation as a reason for choosing your school, you can see all the yellow diamonds are up. Basically, school reputation is more important for parents whose children attend advantaged schools. No? Children, wealthier parents tend to attribute more importance to reputation of the school. And again, you can see that actually is a predictor for school performance. Students whose parents consider school reputation important or very important tend to perform higher in at least most of the countries for which we have comparative data. So again, you can see how these kinds of attitudes and expectations that drive the choice of schools actually have an impact on learning outcomes even after we take the social background of students in schools and parents into account. So school choice can be a variable that actually then reinforces inequalities if it's not very carefully managed. Grade repetition, I mentioned already. Again, one variable that is closely related to inequities in education systems. And you can see here the percentage of students who have repeated a school year, particularly in the Latin countries, very, very high. But what is encouraging that in most countries, it's actually significantly declined since 2009. And you can see the diamond is higher than the blue bar, showing you that actually in some countries, actually, grade repetition has halved almost. Now, if you look to Malta, if you look to Indonesia, if you look to Latvia, and so on, there are a fair number of countries where grade repetition rates have been significantly reduced, and that's an important step in the right direction because we've seen before that grade repetition tends to reinforce the impact of social background on learning outcomes. What is also important that the student's socioeconomic profile actually is very importantly related to this. You can see here that students with a higher socioeconomic status in almost all countries are less likely to have repeated a grade. You come from a privileged background, even if I take into account your science outcomes. You take a student from a wealthy family and from a poor family, they have the same science score. Well, the student from the poor family is a lot more likely to have repeated the grade than a student with a wealthy background. So again, this shows you that most devices in education that we use to stratify students are not only academically selective. That's of course, something that these policies intend to, but they end up to be also socially selective, and that's clearly an unintended and negative side effect. When you look at enrollment in pre-vocational or vocational programs, you can also see how closely that relates to this socioeconomic profile. Disadvantaged schools, advantaged schools. You can see basically in disadvantaged schools, enrollment in vocational programs is a lot more likely than in particularly on the left side of the chart. When you look to Croatia, Austria, Slovenia, Italy, Montenegro, and so on, there you can really see there's almost no likelihood, if you come from a wealthy family, for you to go vocational education, where people from disadvantaged backgrounds are almost inevitably ending up in a vocational track. So again, you can see here school programs can also become one of those variables reinforcing social disparities. Last but not least, student-teacher ratios and class size. On the vertical axis, you see the student-teacher ratio. On the horizontal axis, you see the class size. And you know, if you think about this superficially, you might think the two are the same. You know, the number of teachers that you spend per student and the size of the class, they should be highly related. But as you can see from the charts here, they're not. You can, for example, compare the United States with Vietnam or Chinese Taipei. They have a similar student-staff ratio, so they have a similar amount of teachers for a similar amount of students. But in the case of Vietnam, the class size is almost twice as big as in the United States. How can that be? Well, the answer is that teachers in the United States do very little other things than teaching. So the United States uses its teachers very intensively for teaching purposes. That's how they can afford so small class sizes. Whereas in Vietnam, teachers have a lot of other responsibilities than teaching. They spend a lot of time preparing lessons. They spend a lot of time working with parents, working with individual students. They have a very different kind of set of responsibilities, and many of those responsibilities actually allow them to address individual students' needs much more closely than is the case in the United States, where teachers teach. So again, this is another way in which resource allocations, and I'm talking about policy here because, you know, the student-staff ratio is what you spend. That determines your spending. How you use that spending, that's the policy variable. That's the class size. And you can see actually that varies hugely across countries in similar contexts, and that can have an impact on how equitably resources are allocated. In addition to what I showed you at the beginning, how well we do in terms of attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classes. Last point I want to highlight is governance. You can see that, you know, public and private schools, when you account for socio-economic status, don't show much of a difference in most countries. In general, you can say that public schools do a little bit better than private schools, but in most countries, actually, the difference is small or not measurable. But, you know, before you account for social background, all of the yellow diamonds that represent that are actually on the lower part, telling you that actually, after accounting for social background, there's not much of a performance difference between public and private schools, but before accounting for it, actually, there's a huge advantage for private schools. So these data also show you that the public-private divide can be reinforcing socioeconomic disparities. In terms of the added value, and that's about public policies, we don't see much of a difference, but in terms of the social outcomes, you can see actually that this makes a quite important difference. Finding ways, but it's not in all countries. There are some countries which are actually quite successful in minimizing that gap. So where actually students are not segregated by their social background along with public-private lines, where that disadvantage doesn't play out as strongly. So obviously it's something that can be done. School autonomy, another governance aspect, you can see actually that in most countries, advantaged schools have a greater degree of school autonomy. Overall, we see also that school autonomy is positively related to outcomes, and you can see that privileged schools tend to have greater levels of school autonomy than disadvantaged schools. So again, you can see how governance variables interact with the social background of schools. And finally, the correlations between the responsibility for school governance and science performance. You can see where principals have responsibility for resources, for curriculum, for disciplinary policies, for assessment policies, for admission. You can see as a tendency higher performance, where teachers are engaged in curriculum, discipline, assessment. Results tend to be better. For school boards, it's not so clear. Local or regional authorities, we don't see much of a difference. And then at the national level, the bars tend to go down. Obviously, that's not negative in absolute terms, but when you look at this as a zero-sum game, you know, who has responsibility, you can see actually where responsibility is really at the front line. By school principals and teachers, you do see actually that we see an important impact on learning outcomes. What the causal nature of the relationship is here is very difficult to answer, but you do see that relationship. And that's all I wanted to share with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Andreas. Yes, indeed, we do have several questions from our participants today. The first is, what accounts for the change in the United States, the improvement in equity that was seen over the period? And in addition to that question, we could also ask the same question about Mexico and Brazil. You highlighted those two countries as well. Are the same kinds of policies being used in all three countries, or are there different policies that are accounting for this improvement?
And it's a very difficult question. You know, what I've done is I've highlighted the mix of factors that are associated with inequalities, and they may play out very differently across countries, and there will most likely be also important factors that we did not capture in our PISA assessments. So this is only a partial picture, and we have not been able to actually track that over time. What I can say is that in many of the countries where you did see a reduction in the achievement gap, like the United States, actually the achievement gap has been quite at the center of policy attention for some time. So it's not, you know, that is completely unexpected, but what combination lies behind the improvement from among the factors that I've shown, that is not something that we are able to show with our data.
Another of the participants asked, or maybe observation, that no country seems to have improved in both its equity and performance simultaneously. Does this mean that equity and integration policies can be damaging to top-performing students?
Well, you know, it's an important question, but if you look at the first chart that I showed, there is actually no apparent trade-off between quality and equity in an education system. If you remember the chart on the vertical axis, learning outcomes, on the horizontal axis, equity, you could find countries all over the place. So it's not that, you know, higher equity means lower performance. You're quite right. While we have seen a few countries improving outcomes and a few countries improving equity, it seems to be very, very difficult to manage both of those aspects in time. And I give you an example. You know, if you look at countries like Mexico or Brazil or Peru or Colombia, they have been very successful in integrating more children into schooling and at the same time raising the bar in terms of improving learning outcomes, at least in some areas, but to also moderate the socio-economic background of students has not been, you know, achieved by those countries at the same time often. Right? So, but I would not go as far as saying that efforts to raise learning outcomes have a detrimental effect on equity or vice versa. There's no evidence that would suggest it either.
Okay. Another question here from someone who seems to know about what resilience is and the fact that many disadvantaged students are able to overcome the deficits of their background to actually perform very, very well, internationally speaking. Is this resilience all about personal motivation? Is it about the way their families or parents bring them up? Or is there evidence that schools can make a difference in helping disadvantaged children to succeed?
Yeah, the fact that resilience varies so significantly across countries and indeed across schools suggests that there are probably things that interact with resilience. Obviously, there's a motivation component. It may be a family component. Now, resilience tends to be very high in many of the East Asian countries, where actually families do have high expectations and very strong support for education. Those things certainly do matter. But I would also argue that the between-school variability and in part the between-country variability suggests that policy and practice can have an influence on that.
A very timely question. Can the rise in immigration explain why some countries have seen no improvements in equity or in performance?
We actually have, first of all, we see no relationship between the share of immigrants in a country and its overall standing on the PISA test. We also have seen no change in performance that we can explain by an increase or decrease in the share of students with an immigrant background. It all is really a matter of integration. Countries differ much more in their capacity to integrate students with an immigrant background very effectively. and that seems to be the major driver for the performance gap. So it's not the. We've also, of course, looked at composition effect. The country of origin is one of the factors that you need to consider, but the country of destination typically has a far greater impact on performance on PISA than the country of origin, even after accounting for social background. So all of this together suggests that policy and practice have a very significant impact, and that it is not immigration or social background that drives the outcomes that we see.
Another of our participants asked, is the key to introduce more primary education? And the same person asked what your conclusions and recommendations are to policymakers to help close the equity gap.
Now, pre-primary education is an obvious lever, and in fact, we do see that you can see the effects of that even at age 15. Children who had spent more time in early childhood education and care tend to come out better on the PISA test. That is, I think, an indisputable fact. To what extent, that is a better investment than to focus on the quality of teaching or on good socio-economic intervention in school, there's difficult to answer. Probably, the mix of policies and practices. If you only invest in early childhood education and care, and then, you do not pick up those investments when students move into primary and secondary education, maybe that investment gets lost. And at least that's the effect that, the large inequality in countries like France suggests. They have great education, early childhood education and care, but still are a highly inequitable education system. So probably the effects of those early investments then get lost in the system. So it's really about a holistic approach where early childhood education and care is an important part of the mix.
And probably equally important is the question about teachers, and we have a question about them as well. How can countries attract teachers to disadvantaged schools?
Yeah, actually, that you could see on the chart that this varies enormously across countries, and there are various mechanisms that are in play. Money is one of them. You can actually offer teachers monetary rewards for taking on tougher schools, tougher classrooms. That has proved quite difficult. The more common and maybe successful way is actually to build that into career incentives. And China is particularly successful with this. Basically, you advance best in your career if you take on a tougher school and tougher class. If you are a vice principal in a high-performing school and one day you want to become a principal, the system will tell you, well, first help us turn around one of the lowest performing schools. So those career incentives can be particularly effective. At least we see them in play in several of the highest performing countries. Japan reallocates teachers every 3 years between schools, and that also has shown to be quite effective in making sure that teachers teach where they can actually help best. But pairing high and low performing schools, some states in Brazil have done that very successfully. Again, Shanghai in China is pursuing this. So there are various devices how we can ensure that the resources are put there where they can make most of a difference.
Thank you. A somewhat similar question. Is it difficult to balance investing in the kind of highly cost-efficient, high-populated areas where students often have higher socioeconomic status, and investing in rural low population areas where the incomes might be considerably lower?
Yeah, these are difficult trade-offs that countries need to make. Inequality and outcomes can be driven by different factors. And one of them can be, in urban areas, you will have the inequalities will often have a different nature than the inequality that may arise from living in rural areas. So balancing this is a very difficult act. There are also some of the countries have been struggling with consolidating rural schools. It's a very difficult decision that countries need to make. Often it is very difficult to provide high quality teaching in very small schools. So at the same time, if you take out the school out of a small village, you take out the heart of that village. So these decisions, equity versus other considerations are very, very difficult decisions, and ultimately it's a question of balance.
Another of our participants asks, may we conclude that systems that apply more authoritarian, more prescriptive approaches to education, such as those seen in East Asia, manage more successfully to tackle underachievement among disadvantaged students?
I'm not sure you can conclude that. You look at Finland or many of the Nordic countries in Europe, or Canada in North America. They have been highly successful in matching resources with needs. I do think it requires policy. You see, I mean, if your question goes in the direction, can we leave that, will markets sort it out themselves? I would be very doubtful. I do think policy has a very important role in setting the context and the incentives for actually matching resources with needs. But I don't think there's any suggestion that, it does require kind of top-down intervention mechanism to achieve that.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you all to all of our participants for your interest in PISA and in the OECD's work on education. As always, we invite you to visit the PISA website, www.oecd.org/PISA, where you'll find the first 2 volumes of the PISA 2015 report, links to this issue and previous issues of PISA in Focus, several videos about PISA, and much, much more about PISA. This webinar has been recorded and will be available in a couple of days on our education website, www.oecd.org/edu. Once again, thank you very much for being with us.